Hey guys, tonight we're talking about medieval daily life, also known as being in pain and pretending that's normal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval people did not wake up feeling refreshed. There was no rise and shine, because nothing was shining, and rising felt like a personal insult. They woke up already injured, not in a dramatic, lawsuit-worthy way, but in the deeply inconvenient long-term way that never improves and has no exciting story attached to it. Beds were part of the problem. A medieval bed was usually a wooden frame topped with a sack of straw that had been sat on, slept on, and emotionally given up on years earlier. If the straw was fresh, it poked you. If it was old, it had collapsed into strange shapes that targeted your spine with surgical precision. Pillows were rare. Mattresses were a rumour. Comfort was not a priority. Survival had budget constraints. Sitting up triggered the first wave of negotiations with your body. Knees crackled like old floorboards. Backs stiffened immediately, as if protesting the audacity of movement. Necks turned only halfway before filing a formal complaint. None of this caused alarm. If you woke up without pain, that was concerning. It suggested illness, youth, or suspicious levels of wealth. Cold added a special layer of cruelty. Winter mornings meant muscles that felt frozen into place, fingers that refused to cooperate, and joints that responded to movement with sharp reminders of yesterday's poor decisions. That first step out of bed was a gamble. Sometimes your legs held. Sometimes they reminded you that you carried grain sacks yesterday and would be carrying them again today, whether you liked it or not. Pain did not reset overnight. There was no sleep it off. Pain stacked like unpaid taxes. Yesterday's soreness joined last week's strain, which teamed up with an injury from years ago that never healed correctly and now made surprise appearances during weather changes. Medieval bodies aged aggressively. By 30, many people moved like modern retirees who had angered their chiropractor, and yet no one lingered in bed. Staying down didn't reduce pain, it only delayed work. Animals still needed feeding. Fires needed tending. Fields waited patiently. Pain was not a valid excuse. It was simply the default setting. There wasn't even language for chronic pain. There was just life. Nobody asked how you felt, because the answer was obvious. Of course you hurt. Everyone did. The only real question was whether you could still stand up and keep going. So medieval mornings didn't begin with coffee or motivation. They began with pain, familiar, unavoidable, and already penciled into the day's schedule. If medieval mornings began with back pain, they quickly escalated to mouth pain. Toothaches weren't a medical issue, they were a lifestyle. Almost everyone had at least one tooth that hurt constantly, throbbed randomly, or flared up whenever the weather changed, which in medieval times was always. Dental hygiene as a concept did not exist. Teeth were cleaned accidentally, usually by eating coarse bread that scraped them like sandpaper. Sugar wasn't the problem yet. Survival was. Cracked teeth, worn enamel, and exposed nerves were common. Cavities formed slowly and then announced themselves dramatically, usually in the middle of the night, when pain has the most personality. Infection was frequent. Abscesses swelled under the jaw, creating faces that looked permanently annoyed. Pus drained. Pain radiated into the ear, the eye, the soul. And yet, people carried on, because stopping work due to dental pain was considered deeply impractical. You could still walk. You could still lift things. Therefore, you were fine. There were treatments, technically. Herbs were chewed. Cloves were held against aching teeth. Alcohol was applied generously, both to the mouth and to the person. When pain became unbearable, extraction was an option, performed by barbers, blacksmiths, or anyone confident enough to own pliers. Anesthesia consisted of holding still and rethinking your life choices. Sometimes the tooth came out cleanly. Sometimes it shattered. Sometimes the infection spread. This was viewed as unfortunate but not shocking. Medical risk was part of the experience. Complaining didn't improve outcomes, and pain was seen as something to be endured quietly, preferably without disturbing others. Tooth loss was common by early adulthood. Missing teeth weren't stigmatized. They were expected. A full set of teeth was suspicious. It suggested either youth or divine favoritism. By middle age, most people had gaps, worn stubs, or teeth that technically existed but served no functional purpose beyond reminding you they were there. And the pain never really stopped. It dulled. It ebbed. It flared without warning. People learned to eat on one side of their mouth, to avoid certain textures, to accept that sharp jolts of pain were just part of chewing. Meals weren't about pleasure. They were about survival and careful positioning. In medieval life, tooth pain wasn't something you dealt with. It was something you incorporated into your personality. After waking up sore and enduring a mouth that felt actively hostile, medieval people placed their feet on the ground, and the suffering continued immediately. Feet were the unsung heroes of medieval pain. They carried bodies everywhere, all day, on surfaces that ranged from frozen mud to jagged stone, and they received absolutely no gratitude for it. Shoes, when they existed, were thin, stiff, and shaped more like an insult than footwear. They had no cushioning, no arch support, and no concept of left or right. Many were hand-me-downs, patched repeatedly, and only vaguely related to the size of the foot inside them. Walking long distances in these was not exercise. It was a slow negotiation between skin, bone, and regret. Blisters were constant. They formed, burst, scabbed over, and reopened in a neat little cycle that never ended. Cuts from stones and frozen ruts were common, as were bruises from dropped tools, livestock stepping where they shouldn't, and life in general. None of this was considered injury. It was simply what happened when you used your feet for survival. In winter, things escalated. Cold crept in through thin leather and cracked seams, numbing toes until they burned, then burned until they went numb again. Frostbite wasn't rare. It was seasonal. Losing feeling in your toes was expected. Losing toes entirely was unfortunate but not shocking. Limping through winter was normal. Limping permanently was a milestone. Infection was the quiet threat beneath it all. Open sores met dirt daily. Cleaning was minimal. Painful swelling and redness were ignored until they physically prevented walking. And even then, people often pushed through. A foot that hurt but still worked was considered functional. By adulthood, most people walked with a slight limp, uneven stride, or careful gait designed to minimize pain. This wasn't a disability. It was adulthood. Children learned early to toughen their feet, to accept soreness as part of movement, and to stop reacting dramatically to pain that wasn't immediately life-threatening. And yet, medieval people walked constantly. To fields, to markets, to churches, to neighbouring villages. There was no alternative. If your feet failed, your life shrank instantly. So people endured the pain, adjusted their pace, and carried on. In medieval times, healthy feet didn't mean pain-free feet. They meant feet that still worked, despite everything done to them. Medieval pain wasn't always sharp or dramatic. Often it was quiet, persistent, and located directly in the stomach. Hunger was not an emergency state. It was the default setting. Medieval people did not expect to feel full. Ever. Feeling satisfied after a meal was a rare, suspicious sensation, usually followed by the realization that you would be paying for it later. Food existed, but abundance did not. Diets were repetitive, limited, and heavily dependent on the season. Bread made up the bulk of calories, and even that was often coarse, gritty, and aggressively stale. Vegetables were eaten when available. Meat appeared occasionally, like a guest who never stayed long enough to make an impression. As a result, hunger pains were constant. Not the dramatic starvation you see in disasters, but a dull, hollow ache that lived quietly in the background of daily life. A gnawing reminder that your body was operating on minimum resources. People learned to work through it. Hunger wasn't something you fixed. It was something you managed, like a bad knee or a tooth that hurt when it rained. Meals were planned around survival, not enjoyment. Portions were small. Second helpings were theoretical. Children grew up knowing the feeling of hunger so well that it stopped registering as pain and became a sensation like thirst or fatigue. Inconvenient, but familiar. During hard years, hunger intensified. Poor harvests, bad weather, war or illness could push people from constant hunger into real starvation. But even then, there was little room for panic. You couldn't stop working because you were hungry. In fact, hunger often meant you needed to work more, which was deeply unfair, but rarely questioned. Hunger also affected the body in subtle ways. Dizziness was common. Weakness was expected. People fainted occasionally and then got back up, mildly embarrassed. A lack of nutrients led to brittle bones, sore joints, and slow healing. More pain layered on top of existing pain, quietly reinforcing itself. And yet, medieval people developed coping strategies. They drank watered-down ale for calories. They stretched meals with fillers. They ate things modern people would politely refuse. Hunger shaped habits, priorities, and even morality. Waste was a sin not because it was unethical, but because it physically hurt to imagine throwing food away. In medieval life, hunger wasn't a crisis. It was a companion, ever-present, dull, and entirely unremarkable. If hunger was the background hum of medieval life, back pain was the soundtrack. It began early, escalated quickly, and never truly left. Medieval people didn't develop back pain. They inherited it from childhood, like an unwanted family tradition. Work started young. Children carried water, gathered firewood, hauled baskets, and helped in the fields long before their bodies had any business doing so. There was no concept of growing pains. Pain meant you were useful. If a child could lift something, they were expected to lift it, repeatedly, daily, and without complaint. By adolescence, backs were already compromised. Spines bent forward slightly from constant labour. Muscles hardened unevenly. Posture adjusted itself around pain, creating new pain in the process. By adulthood, most people moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned exactly which motions hurt the least. The work itself was relentless, lifting sacks of grain, carrying water in heavy buckets balanced on yokes, digging frozen soil, threshing, harvesting, stacking, loading. Everything involved bending, twisting, lifting, and holding weight in deeply unhelpful positions. And there were no breaks in the modern sense. You stopped when the light failed or when your body physically refused to continue, whichever came last. There was no treatment, no stretching routines, no ergonomic advice. If your back hurt, you adjusted your grip, shifted the load, or leaned slightly to one side and hoped that solved it. Sometimes it did. Often it didn't. A bad back wasn't diagnosed. It was acknowledged briefly and then ignored. Severe injuries happened. Slipped discs, crushed vertebrae, pulled muscles that never healed correctly. People worked through them because not working wasn't an option. A person who couldn't lift was a burden, and being a burden was more dangerous than pain. By middle age, many people were visibly hunched. Not from age alone, but from years of adaptation. The spine learned to curve to protect itself. Pain dictated posture. Pain shaped movement. Pain became the silent architect of the medieval body. And yet, no one thought this was unusual. A straight, pain-free back wasn't the goal. Function was. If you could still carry, bend, and work, even slowly, you were considered healthy. In medieval life, back pain wasn't a condition. It was proof you had survived long enough to earn it. In medieval life, injuries didn't announce themselves with drama. They arrived quietly, settled in, and refused to leave. Small cuts, scrapes, splinters, and burns were part of daily existence. So common, they barely registered as injuries at all. If you waited for your skin to be unbroken before working, you would never work. Hands were the worst. They were constantly exposed to tools, rough wood, thorns, rope, metal, and the occasional angry animal. Knuckles were cracked, fingers were nicked, palms carried old scars layered on top of new ones, like a personal injury scrapbook nobody asked for. A hand without cuts was either suspicious or belonged to a child who hadn't been useful yet. These wounds didn't heal quickly. Cleanliness was minimal, bandages were improvised, and the idea of keeping a wound sterile had not yet occurred to anyone. Dirt entered cuts daily. So did manure, dust, and whatever else happened to be nearby. Pain flared, subsided, and then returned when the wound was reopened by more work. Burns were equally normal. Cooking over open flames meant scorched fingers, singed arms, and the occasional serious burn when a pot tipped or embers escaped. Burn scars were common and unremarkable. If someone complained about a burn, the usual response was a glance and a nod. Yes, that happens. Infection was the unspoken threat behind every injury. Redness, swelling, warmth, and pain were watched with mild concern. If the wound still allowed movement, it was ignored. Only when a limb stopped functioning did alarm set in, and by then, it was often too late. Amputation existed, but it was drastic, dangerous, and often fatal in itself. Most wounds simply lingered. They scabbed over, cracked open, scabbed again, and slowly formed scars that thickened the skin and dulled sensation. Pain didn't disappear. It became familiar. People learned which cuts hurt worse in the cold, which burned when wet, and which should not be bumped under any circumstances. Children learned early not to cry over small injuries. Crying didn't fix the cut, and attention was better saved for emergencies. A scraped knee earned sympathy for about 3 seconds. Then it was time to keep moving. In medieval times, wounds weren't treated as temporary setbacks. They were long-term companions. And pain was simply the body reminding you that you were still using it. Medieval cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was invasive. It didn't stop at the skin. It moved inward, settled into joints, and made itself at home. Cold-induced pain wasn't an occasional problem. It was a seasonal identity. Houses offered very little protection. Walls leaked air, roofs leaked snow, and fires were small, smoky, and never quite enough. When winter arrived, fingers stiffened first, then toes, then ears, noses, and anything else that stuck out into the world with unfortunate confidence. Numbness was common. Burning pain followed. People learned to accept both without comment. Cold pain showed up in stages. At first, there was the sharp sting. Fingers aching as they worked in freezing air, skin cracking until it bled. Then came the dull ache, a deep soreness in joints that never fully warmed again. Knees protested. Wrists throbbed. Old injuries resurfaced like ghosts with unfinished business. Frostbite wasn't rare or dramatic. It was quiet. Skin went pale. Sensation faded. Sometimes it returned. Sometimes it didn't. Losing feeling in a finger was annoying. Losing the finger itself was unfortunate, but survivable. People adapted. Gloves were crude. Mittens were better, but rare. Most warmth came from movement, which was painful in its own way. Cold also amplified every existing ache. A bad back hurt more. Old cuts throbbed. Tooth pain intensified because of course it did. Winter was when the body reminded you of everything you'd ever done wrong. And unlike today, there was no waiting it out indoors. Work continued. Fields didn't care. Animals still needed attention. The cold didn't pause life. It sharpened it. Sleep offered little relief. Nights were long and freezing. Bodies curled inward, trying to conserve heat. Muscles tightened defensively. People woke up stiffer than they went to bed, already bracing for another day of pain. And yet, medieval people rarely described cold pain as suffering. It was simply winter. Complaining about it was like complaining about gravity. Everyone experienced it. Everyone endured it. Those who didn't adapt didn't last. In medieval life, cold wasn't something you avoided. It was something you lived inside. And the pain it caused wasn't exceptional. It was expected, seasonal, and quietly accepted as part of being alive. For medieval women, pain wasn't an occasional visitor. It was scheduled, and nothing on that schedule compared to childbirth. This was not a dramatic once-in-a-lifetime ordeal. It was a recurring event, expected, unavoidable, and approached with the same resigned attitude as winter or taxes. There was no anesthesia, no pain relief worth mentioning, no emergency backup plan that didn't involve prayer. Childbirth happened at home, on straw, surrounded by women who had survived it themselves and therefore considered screaming entirely reasonable but medically irrelevant. Labour was long, hours or days of pain, exhaustion and uncertainty, all while fully conscious and deeply aware that this was one of the most dangerous moments of your life. Complications were common: hemorrhage, infection, tearing, all normal risks. Survival was never guaranteed, and everyone involved knew it. And yet, this wasn't framed as extraordinary suffering. It was framed as fate. Women were expected to endure childbirth the way men were expected to endure war or hard labour. Pain was part of duty. Complaining didn't make it shorter, safer, or less fatal, so there was little point. What followed was equally unforgiving. Recovery was brief or non-existent. Within days, sometimes hours, women were back on their feet, tending fires, feeding animals, caring for other children. The body barely had time to understand what had happened before being told to continue functioning. Pain lingered. Pelvic injuries, chronic discomfort, weakness, and complications that never healed properly were common. These weren't treated as medical issues. They were accepted as the price of survival and motherhood. A woman who moved carefully or slowly after childbirth wasn't injured. She was normal. The emotional toll existed too, though it wasn't discussed. Fear, grief, exhaustion, and loss were wrapped tightly in silence. Infant mortality was high. Many women experienced repeated births and repeated losses. Pain wasn't just physical, it was cumulative. And yet, childbirth remained routine. It was talked about practically, not emotionally. Instructions were passed down. Stories were shared without dramatics. Pain was acknowledged, but not centered. It was something you endured because there was no alternative. In medieval life, childbirth pain wasn't a crisis. It was an expectation. And surviving it didn't mean you were healed. It meant you were needed again immediately. Once childbirth was over, or even when it wasn't, medieval women returned to another recurring feature of daily life: menstrual pain. This wasn't a monthly inconvenience managed with rest, heat, and medication. It was something you worked through quietly, while pretending nothing unusual was happening. There was no real concept of privacy. Houses were small, shared, and busy. Work did not stop because of cramps, fatigue, or blood loss. Fields still needed tending. Food still needed cooking. Children still needed watching. If you were upright and breathing, you were expected to function. Pain during menstruation was common and understood, but not accommodated. Cramps were expected. Back pain intensified. Weakness and dizziness happened. Some women fainted. This was considered inconvenient but not alarming. You were helped up, given a moment, and then expected to continue. Hygiene was practical, not comfortable. Women used cloths, rags, moss, or whatever absorbent material was available. These had to be washed, reused, and hidden discreetly. Leaks happened. Stains happened. Shame happened. Pain was physical, but embarrassment added its own quiet layer of suffering. Medical explanations ranged from unhelpful to deeply suspicious. Menstruation was often seen as a necessary release of excess blood. Pain was sometimes interpreted as imbalance, weakness, or moral failing, none of which resulted in effective treatment. Remedies included herbs, rest if possible, and prayer if not. and rest was rarely possible. Women worked bent over, lifting, kneeling, carrying weight, all while their bodies were already under strain. Menstrual pain didn't pause life. It blended into it, becoming another sensation layered beneath hunger, fatigue, and cold. There was also no clear permission to talk about it. Pain was acknowledged indirectly, in knowing looks and brief comments, but rarely discussed openly. Complaining too much was frowned upon. Endurance was praised. Silence was expected. Over time, women learned to read their own bodies with precision. Which days would be worse? How to pace movement? When to push through and when to slow slightly without drawing attention? Pain management was self-taught and invisible. In medieval life, menstrual pain wasn't medicalized. It wasn't treated. It wasn't centered. It was endured, quietly, repeatedly, and without apology. Because pain, like everything else, was simply part of being useful. If medieval bodies could speak, their joints would be the loudest complainers, and they would have earned it. Joint pain wasn't something that appeared later in life after decades of work. It arrived early, settled in, and became a permanent feature by the time most people reached adulthood. Medieval work was repetitive, in the most unforgiving way possible. The same motions, performed thousands of times, every day, without variation or rest. Kneeling to plant, squatting to harvest, lifting and lowering tools in identical rhythms, carrying loads with shoulders and hips that never got a day off. Joints didn't get to recover. They were expected to adapt or fail quietly. Knees suffered first. Constant kneeling on hard ground wore them down quickly. Pain, swelling, stiffness, all normal. Many people learned to rise from the ground slowly, using hands for support, not because they were old, but because their knees had already resigned from active service. Wrists and elbows followed. Repetitive gripping, twisting, hammering, weaving, and carrying inflamed joints until movement itself caused pain. Fingers swelled and stiffened, especially in the cold. Fine motor skills declined early. This was inconvenient but acceptable, as long as you could still work. Shoulders carried their share of misery. Heavy loads balanced on yokes compressed joints and strained muscles. Rotator cuffs didn't tear in medieval vocabulary. They simply stopped working properly, leaving one arm weaker, slower, or permanently painful. Arthritis existed, though no one called it that. Stiff joints in the morning, aching pain in damp weather, reduced range of motion, all familiar sensations. People adjusted how they moved, favouring certain sides, limiting unnecessary motions, and quietly reshaping their bodies around pain. And again, none of this was treated as illness. There were no braces, no supports, no rehabilitation. Pain was not a diagnosis. It was a signal to modify behaviour slightly while continuing to work. A joint that hurt but still functioned was considered healthy enough. By middle age, many people moved with careful efficiency. No wasted gestures, no sudden movements. Every action was planned to minimise pain. This wasn't caution. It was experience. In medieval life, joint pain wasn't a warning sign. It was confirmation. Confirmation that you had worked, survived, and were still needed, even if your knees strongly disagreed. In medieval times, being sick didn't automatically mean stopping. It meant continuing, just more slowly, more painfully, and with a vague sense that things might get worse before they got fatal. Illness wasn't a break from daily pain. It was simply another layer added on top of everything else. Fevers were common. Coughs lingered for months. Infections came and went, sometimes leaving, sometimes deciding to stay forever. People walked around dizzy, sweating, aching, and exhausted because staying in bed wasn't an option unless you were actively dying, and even then the timing had to be convenient. Pain from illness was treated with patience, not intervention. Headaches were endured, body aches were ignored. Stomach pain was unfortunate but expected. Parasites caused cramps, weakness, and malnutrition, yet were considered an unpleasant fact of life rather than a medical emergency. You didn't have worms. You were alive, which apparently implied worms. Medical treatment existed, but relief was not guaranteed. Bloodletting was popular, which is impressive considering how weak people already were. The logic was simple. If something hurts, remove some blood. This rarely helped, but it did add a new pain to distract from the old one, which may have been the goal. Herbal remedies were used carefully and repeatedly. Some helped slightly, some did nothing. Some made things worse. Since pain was already normal, figuring out whether a treatment worked was difficult. If you survived, it was considered effective. Infectious diseases caused deep, lingering discomfort. Joints ached, muscles burned, breathing hurt, skin erupted in rashes or sores. People worked through it until they physically couldn't. At that point, neighbours stepped in, not out of charity alone, but because letting someone die meant losing labour. Children learned early that illness wasn't an excuse. A sick child was a quiet child. A quiet child was assumed to be coping. Only extreme symptoms prompted concern. Otherwise, sickness blended into the background of daily pain, like hunger or fatigue, and recovery was rarely complete. Many illnesses left behind permanent weakness, joint pain, or breathing problems. People didn't expect to return to full health. They expected to return to functionality. In medieval life, illness wasn't about comfort or care. It was about endurance. Pain didn't mean something was wrong. It meant you were still here. Sleep in medieval times was less about rest and more about temporary unconsciousness. It happened when exhaustion finally won, and it ended the moment discomfort reasserted control. A full night of uninterrupted sleep was not a goal. It was a rumour. Beds, as mentioned earlier, were not allies. They were surfaces you tolerated. Straw shifted. Wooden frames creaked. Lumps appeared where no lumps had existed before. If you slept well, it was mostly because your body had given up arguing. Waking up sore wasn't a sign of a bad night. It was proof you had slept at all. Nighttime brought its own collection of aches. Cold seeped in as fires died down. Muscles tightened defensively. Old injuries took the opportunity to remind you they were still employed. People woke frequently, not refreshed, but repositioning, slowly, carefully, so as not to anger anything important. Noise didn't help. Animals moved. Wind rattled walls. Other people snored, coughed, or talked in their sleep. Privacy was non-existent. Silence was accidental. If you slept through the night, it meant you were either extremely tired or extremely lucky, neither of which lasted. And then there were nighttime obligations. Fires needed tending. Animals needed checking. Babies cried. Sick family members needed watching. Sleep was fragmented into pieces that never quite added up to rest. People learned to operate permanently tired, their bodies moving on habit rather than energy. The result was constant, low-grade pain. Headaches from poor sleep, muscle aches from incomplete recovery. Joints stiffened further without proper rest. Fatigue magnified every other pain. Hunger hurt more, cold cut deeper, injuries throbbed louder. There was no concept of sleep hygiene, no advice about posture, pillows, or consistent schedules. The body adapted the only way it could, by lowering expectations. People learned to function while tired, to make fewer movements, to conserve energy instinctively, to accept that being exhausted was the baseline. Children grew up watching adults operate this way and assumed it was normal, because it was. You didn't expect to feel rested. You expected to feel capable enough to keep going. In medieval life, sleep wasn't restorative. It was survival's pause button. And waking up aching wasn't a failure. It was confirmation that you'd made it through another night. Medieval people didn't separate emotional pain from physical pain. There was no neat distinction between what hurt in the body and what hurt in the mind. It all arrived together, tangled up, and generally settled somewhere in the chest or stomach. Stress was constant. Survival depended on weather, harvests, health, and the moods of people with swords and authority. Anxiety didn't come with a label. It came as tight muscles, shallow breathing, headaches, stomach cramps, and a persistent sense that something bad was probably about to happen. Because often it was. Grief was everywhere. Death wasn't rare or shocking. It was routine. Children died. Spouses died. Friends disappeared quietly. People mourned, but briefly. There was work to do, mouths to feed, and no space for extended emotional collapse. Grief didn't get processed. It got carried. And carrying it hurt. Fear also lived in the body. Fear of famine. Fear of illness. Fear of punishment. Fear of losing what little you had. This fear showed up as clenched jaws, tense shoulders, restless sleep, and digestive problems that never fully resolved. Medieval people didn't say they were anxious. They said they felt unwell, heavy, or weak. Sadness wasn't discussed openly. Expressing emotional pain too loudly was seen as indulgent or disruptive. Strength meant endurance, so feelings stayed inside, where they did what feelings always do when ignored. They found physical outlets. Headaches were common. Chest tightness was common. Stomach pain without clear cause was common. None of this was diagnosed. It was accepted as part of the human condition. If you could still work, the pain was considered manageable. Religion shaped how emotional pain was interpreted. Suffering was often seen as meaningful or instructive. Pain could be a test, a lesson, or a reminder of humility. This didn't make it hurt less, but it gave it a framework, which sometimes mattered more than relief. People coped quietly, through routine, through repetition, through small comforts, warmth near the fire, familiar food, familiar faces. There was no expectation of happiness. There was only stability, and stability was precious. In medieval life, emotional pain didn't announce itself dramatically. It manifested physically, subtly, persistently. And like every other ache, it was carried forward, because stopping wasn't an option. In medieval society, pain wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. More than that, it was often framed as useful. Enduring pain quietly was considered a sign of strength, discipline, and moral character. Complaining too much, on the other hand, suggested weakness, self-indulgence, or a troubling lack of gratitude for being alive at all. This attitude shaped how people experienced pain. If something hurt, the first question wasn't, "How do we fix this?" It was, "Can you still work?" If the answer was yes, then the pain was officially classified as acceptable. Pain that interfered with duty mattered. Pain that didn't was your own responsibility. Religion reinforced this mindset. Suffering was rarely random in medieval thinking. Pain could be a test, a punishment, a reminder of humility, or a way to earn spiritual merit. This didn't mean people enjoyed pain. It meant they were taught to interpret it. A sore back wasn't just a sore back, it was part of your role in the world. Tooth pain wasn't unfair, it was character building, apparently. This belief system had practical consequences. People were less likely to seek relief, even when it existed. Taking time to rest could feel morally questionable. Enduring discomfort became a habit, then a virtue. You didn't want to be known as someone who avoided work because of pain. That reputation stuck. Communities reinforced these expectations subtly. Praise went to those who worked through illness or injury. Sympathy was brief and conditional. Help was offered, but only until the person could stand again. Lingering weakness made others uncomfortable. Pain was supposed to be temporary, even when it wasn't. Children absorbed these values early. They learned that scraped knees didn't matter, that fatigue was irrelevant, that silence in the face of discomfort was maturity. By adulthood, most people had internalized the idea that pain was simply part of doing what needed to be done. This didn't make medieval people emotionless or cruel. It made them practical. Life required endurance, and endurance required reframing pain as normal rather than alarming. Accepting pain reduced fear. Fear wasted energy. In medieval life, pain wasn't always seen as a problem to solve. It was a condition to endure, a sign that you were fulfilling your role, however uncomfortable that role happened to be. By the end of a medieval life, pain wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you carried with you, like a tool, a scar, or a familiar ache that no longer needed explanation. Pain was the price of continuing, and most people paid it daily without ceremony. Medieval people did not expect their bodies to feel good. That expectation simply did not exist. A pain-free day wasn't a sign of health. It was suspicious. It suggested that you hadn't worked hard enough, hadn't lifted enough, hadn't endured enough. Comfort was not proof of success. Endurance was. Bodies wore down quickly. By what we would now call middle age, many people moved carefully, spoke less about their aches, and conserved energy instinctively. They didn't complain, because complaining didn't change the outcome. Pain was predictable. It followed work, cold, hunger, illness, and time. You planned around it, adjusted your movements, and kept going. What's striking isn't that medieval people suffered. It's that they normalized it so thoroughly. Pain didn't dominate their identity. It didn't stop the day. It simply existed alongside everything else. People laughed, worked, raised families, argued, prayed, and hoped, all while hurting. Modern people often imagine medieval life as unusually brutal, and in many ways it was. But medieval people didn't experience their pain as a constant emergency. They experienced it as the cost of being alive in a demanding world. A world that required strength, adaptability, and the ability to endure discomfort without collapsing under it. That doesn't mean medieval people were tougher in some heroic sense. They had no alternative. Pain management wasn't a choice. It was a skill learned early and practiced daily. If you couldn't endure pain, life ended quickly. Those who survived weren't fearless. They were accustomed. And perhaps that's the most uncomfortable realization. Medieval pain wasn't dramatic. It was mundane. It was woven into routines, habits, and expectations. It shaped bodies and minds quietly, without spectacle. So when we look back and wonder how people lived like that, the answer is simple and unsettling. They didn't know any other way. In medieval times, pain wasn't a failure of the system. It was the system. And survival meant learning to live inside it, one ache at a time. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol conquests had reached their natural limits. For decades, armies on horseback had thundered across Eurasia, flattening cities, toppling dynasties, and rewriting maps with terrifying speed. Entire regions learned the sound of hooves before they learned the names of their new rulers. But conquest, like fire, eventually consumes what it can. Once the borders stopped expanding, the Mongol world faced a different challenge: how to rule what they had taken. What followed surprised almost everyone. Instead of endless chaos, a kind of brutal order emerged. Roads were repaired, borders stabilized, banditry was crushed with ruthless efficiency. The same empire that had once terrorized cities now had a vested interest in keeping them alive and productive. Trade routes that had been dangerous for centuries suddenly became safer than they had ever been. Merchants who once travelled armed to the teeth now moved under the protection of Mongol law, carrying silk, spices, silver, and ideas across thousands of miles. This was not peace in the modern sense. Executions were swift, punishments severe, and rebellion met with annihilation. But within those harsh boundaries, predictability ruled. The Mongols valued order above sentiment. If taxes were paid and loyalty maintained, daily life could continue with minimal interference. Farmers farmed, artisans worked, scholars debated, traders travelled. Compared to the fragmented warfare of earlier centuries, this stability felt almost miraculous. The Mongol rulers understood something most medieval states struggled with. An empire lives or dies on communication. They built and expanded a vast relay system of roads and stations, allowing messengers to cross continents in days rather than months. Orders flowed outward from imperial centres, and information flowed back just as quickly. For the first time in history, Eurasia functioned like a single, if loosely stitched, political space. Fear still lingered, of course. The memory of destruction was fresh, and Mongol authority rested on the unspoken reminder of what happened to those who resisted. Yet fear alone cannot sustain an empire. What truly defined this period was utility. The Mongols did not care what gods you worshipped, what language you spoke, or what clothes you wore, as long as the system worked. That indifference, paradoxically, created space for exchange. The storm had passed. In its wake stood roads instead of ruins, caravans instead of armies, and a century-long pause in large-scale warfare across much of Eurasia. It was an uneasy calm, built on violence and enforced by power, but it was calm nonetheless. And within that calm, the world began to move in new ways. The Pax Mongolica did not exist by accident. It was engineered through law, discipline, and an unforgiving sense of order. At the heart of Mongol rule was a legal framework often referred to as the yasa, a body of decrees attributed to Genghis Khan and expanded by his successors. It was not a gentle system, nor was it especially flexible, but it was consistent. And in a medieval world where justice often depended on local lords, bribes, or bloodlines, consistency alone was revolutionary. Crime under Mongol rule was treated as a threat to the entire system. Theft, banditry, and fraud were punished harshly, often with death. This was not cruelty for its own sake, it was policy. Merchants had to trust that their goods would reach distant markets intact. Messengers had to know they could cross mountains and deserts without being robbed. The Mongols understood that fear, carefully applied, could eliminate the everyday violence that strangled trade elsewhere. Local elites were largely left in place, provided they cooperated. Governors, princes, and city officials continued to rule their populations, but now they answered upward to Mongol overlords. This reduced resistance and ensured that regional customs survived, while ultimate authority remained firmly centralized. If a region paid its taxes and followed imperial orders, it was mostly left alone. If it failed, the response was swift and unforgettable. One of the most striking features of Mongol administration was its religious tolerance. Unlike many medieval empires, the Mongols showed little interest in converting their subjects. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and shamans all lived under the same imperial umbrella. Religious leaders were often exempt from certain taxes, not out of compassion, but because stability mattered more than belief. A praying population was easier to govern than a rebellious one. The cost of this stability, however, was submission. The peace of the Pax Mongolica rested on the understanding that resistance was futile. Entire cities had been erased earlier in the conquests, and those memories lingered like ghost stories told to keep children obedient. Peace was maintained not by goodwill, but by reputation. Yet for those willing to accept Mongol authority, the rewards were tangible. Safer roads, predictable laws, and access to a continent-wide economy transformed daily life. It was a peace enforced by the sword, but for many, it was preferable to the endless local wars that had come before. Order had a price. Most people paid it quietly and moved on with their lives. If the Pax Mongolica had a physical backbone, it was movement. Goods, people, messages, and ideas flowed across Eurasia with a speed and reliability that would have seemed impossible a century earlier. The Mongols did not invent long-distance trade, but they perfected its protection. Under their rule, the great overland routes linking East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East and Europe became arteries of a single imperial body. Central to this system was the Yam, an extensive relay network of roads and way stations stretching thousands of miles. These stations were stocked with fresh horses, food, and lodging, allowing official messengers to travel enormous distances at staggering speed. A message could cross regions in days that once took months. This was not just convenience. It was control. Rapid communication allowed the Mongol rulers to respond to unrest, adjust taxation, and coordinate distant territories with unprecedented efficiency. Merchants were among the greatest beneficiaries. Traders carried official passports, known as paisa, which granted them safe passage, supplies, and protection throughout the empire. In return, they paid taxes and shared information. Commerce and intelligence became intertwined. A caravan did not just bring silk or spices, it brought news of prices, politics, and potential threats. The roads themselves became cultural crossroads. Persian astronomers met Chinese engineers. Italian merchants encountered Central Asian translators. Medical knowledge, navigation techniques, artistic styles, and military technologies moved alongside luxury goods. Paper currency, printing methods, and gunpowder knowledge travelled westward, while glass-making techniques and artistic motifs moved east. The Mongol peace turned distance into something manageable. Travel was still dangerous, of course. Deserts remained deserts. Mountains did not grow shorter. Disease lurked in crowded caravanserais. But compared to earlier centuries, the risks were dramatically reduced. Bandits knew better than to prey on travellers under Mongol protection. Local officials were held responsible if crimes occurred in their jurisdiction. Failure to maintain order meant punishment, and no one wanted that attention. For the first time, a traveller could plausibly imagine crossing the entire breadth of Eurasia without changing political systems every few weeks. This psychological shift mattered. It encouraged ambition. It encouraged curiosity. It encouraged people to think beyond local horizons. The roads of the Pax Mongolica did more than move objects. They reshaped how people understood the world. Distant lands felt closer. Foreign customs felt less alien. The empire stitched continents together not with walls or borders, but with paths. And once those paths existed, the world could not easily return to isolation. The Mongol conquests had left many cities in ruins, but the Pax Mongolica marked a period of reconstruction rather than abandonment. Once resistance ended, urban centres were no longer targets, they were assets. Cities generated taxes, facilitated trade, and housed the administrators needed to keep the empire running. As a result, many towns that had suffered during the invasions were rebuilt, repopulated, and reintegrated into wider commercial networks. Mongol rulers invested heavily in key cities along major trade routes. Markets were reopened, warehouses expanded, and infrastructure repaired. Caravanserais appeared at regular intervals, offering food, shelter, and storage for merchants and travellers. These were not luxuries, they were economic tools. A well-fed merchant with a safe place to sleep was more likely to keep moving, and movement meant revenue. Urban life under Mongol rule was surprisingly diverse. Cities became melting pots where languages overlapped and customs blended. A single marketplace might include Chinese silk sellers, Persian financiers, Armenian craftsmen, and Italian traders, all operating under the same legal framework. The Mongols themselves often stayed at a distance, preferring to rule indirectly through local officials, while ensuring taxes flowed upward and order was maintained. This diversity extended to professions as well. The Mongols actively relocated skilled workers across the empire. Engineers, doctors, artisans, and scholars were moved, sometimes forcibly, to where their expertise was most useful. A Chinese siege engineer might find himself in the Middle East. A Persian doctor might serve in Central Asia. This movement spread technical knowledge at a speed unseen before, though it came at the cost of personal freedom. Cities also benefited from the Mongol emphasis on documentation and record-keeping. Census-taking became more systematic. Tax categories were standardized. Urban populations were counted, classified, and monitored. While this increased control, it also reduced arbitrary demands. People knew what was expected of them, and predictability again proved valuable. Not all cities thrived equally. Those off the main trade routes often stagnated, while those positioned along major corridors flourished. Geography mattered more than heritage. A strategically placed town could rise quickly, while an ancient city could fade if it no longer served imperial needs. Under the Pax Mongolica, cities became engines of exchange rather than fortresses of survival. Walls still stood, but commerce mattered more than defence. In these urban spaces, the Mongol peace became tangible, not as an abstract policy, but as daily movement, noise, and negotiation. The Pax Mongolica did more than move goods and people. It accelerated the movement of ideas. With roads secured and borders stabilized, knowledge traveled with unprecedented ease. Scholars, artisans, missionaries, and physicians crossed vast distances, carrying techniques and theories that would quietly reshape societies far from their point of origin. The Mongols did not set out to create an intellectual renaissance, but by removing barriers, they made one possible. Technologies developed in East Asia began to circulate widely. Paper production expanded westward, changing how information was recorded and preserved. Printing methods followed, slowly altering access to texts. Gunpowder knowledge migrated beyond its Chinese origins, initially as a curiosity, then as a military innovation that would eventually transform warfare. Even simple inventions, like improved stirrups, saddles, and navigational tools, had outsized effects when shared across cultures. Medical knowledge also flowed along these routes. Islamic physicians exchanged ideas with Chinese doctors, blending herbal remedies, surgical techniques, and diagnostic theories. Hospitals and medical texts benefited from this cross-pollination, though understanding remained limited by medieval science. Astrology, astronomy, mathematics, and geography all experienced similar exchanges, as scholars compared models of the cosmos and refined measurements of time and space. Religion, too, travelled freely. Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, Christian missionaries, and Nestorian priests moved through Mongol lands with relative safety. The empire's tolerance allowed debates and conversions to occur without immediate state interference. Some travellers hoped to win souls, others simply recorded what they saw. Their writings introduced distant cultures to one another, sometimes accurately, sometimes through layers of misunderstanding. Yet this openness had darker consequences. The same networks that carried silk and scholarship also carried disease. Pathogens travelled as efficiently as caravans, moving from region to region with devastating speed. The most infamous example was the plague that would sweep across Eurasia in the 14th century. The Mongol trade routes did not cause it, but they allowed it to spread faster and farther than ever before. The Pax Mongolica thus became a double-edged sword. It enriched cities, expanded knowledge, and connected civilizations, but it also exposed societies to risks they were unprepared to handle. Isolation had once acted as a crude form of protection. Connectivity removed that shield. In linking the world together, the Mongol peace changed the rules of history. Progress and catastrophe now moved along the same roads, and humanity would never again experience ideas or disasters in isolation. Under the Pax Mongolica, trade ceased to be a regional affair and became a truly continental system. For the first time, merchants could plan journeys that spanned thousands of miles with reasonable confidence that the rules would remain the same along the way. Taxes were standardized, routes protected, and disputes settled under a shared imperial framework. This consistency turned commerce into one of the defining forces of the era. Luxury goods moved in enormous volumes: silk from China, spices from Southeast Asia, precious stones from India, silver from Central Asia, and fine textiles from the Islamic world all flowed toward distant markets. These were not novelties reserved for royalty alone. A growing merchant class emerged, wealthy enough to influence local politics and culture. Trade wealth began to rival land ownership as a source of power. The Mongol state actively supported this system. Merchants were granted legal privileges and, in some cases, direct partnerships with Mongol elites. The empire invested in caravans, shared risks, and even compensated traders for losses in certain circumstances. Commerce was not merely tolerated, it was encouraged as a pillar of imperial stability. A prosperous merchant meant a prosperous tax base. Financial innovations followed. Credit systems expanded, allowing merchants to borrow and invest across long distances. Bills of exchange reduced the need to transport large amounts of coin, lowering risk and speeding transactions. Money itself became more abstract, less tied to physical presence. These practices laid early groundwork for later global financial systems. Trade also reshaped social structures. Cities along major routes became cosmopolitan hubs, while rural areas increasingly supplied goods for distant consumers rather than local markets. Artisans adapted their products to foreign tastes. Clothing styles, food preferences, and decorative motifs blended as cultures influenced one another through commerce. Yet this system depended on Mongol power. Protection was enforced, not negotiated. When caravans moved safely, it was because the threat of punishment loomed over anyone tempted to interfere. The peace of the marketplace was backed by the memory of past destruction. Still, for those living within it, the benefits were undeniable. Trade created opportunity, mobility, and wealth on a scale previously unimaginable. It tied livelihoods to distant places and made events in far-off regions suddenly relevant. A failed harvest in one land could ripple across continents. In turning Eurasia into a connected economic zone, the Pax Mongolica transformed trade from a risky gamble into a structured enterprise. Borders blurred, markets expanded, and the world learned, perhaps for the first time, what true economic interdependence felt like. For all its order and prosperity, the Pax Mongolica was never as solid as it appeared. Beneath the surface of stability lay tensions that the Mongol system could suppress, but not eliminate. The empire's vast size, once its greatest strength, gradually became its most serious weakness. Governing lands that stretched across continents required constant coordination, loyalty, and competent leadership, none of which were guaranteed forever. Succession was a persistent problem. Mongol tradition did not enforce a single clear line of inheritance, and every death of a great Khan reopened old rivalries. Brothers, cousins, and sons competed for power, dragging entire regions into political uncertainty. While trade routes remained open, decision-making slowed, and local rulers grew more autonomous. The empire began to fracture into semi-independent khanates, each prioritizing its own interests. Economic strain followed political division. Maintaining roads, relay stations, and military patrols required resources and cooperation. As central authority weakened, funding declined. Corruption crept in. Local officials grew less accountable, and enforcement became uneven. Merchants still travelled, but confidence began to erode. Safety depended increasingly on location, rather than imperial reach. Environmental pressures added to the strain. Climate fluctuations affected pasture lands and agricultural output, undermining the nomadic foundations of Mongol power. Famine and resource shortages increased internal tensions, especially among elites accustomed to abundance. An empire built on movement struggled when movement became harder to sustain. Disease compounded these problems. Repeated outbreaks disrupted labor, trade, and governance. Entire communities vanished, leaving administrative gaps and economic shockwaves. The same interconnectedness that once fueled prosperity now magnified instability. When one region faltered, others felt the impact almost immediately. Perhaps most critically, fear lost its effectiveness over time. The memory of early Mongol destruction faded with each generation. New populations, born under Mongol rule, had not witnessed the initial conquests. Authority based on reputation requires constant reinforcement, and the empire increasingly lacked the unity needed to deliver it. The Pax Mongolica had always been conditional, a peace dependent on strength, coordination, and momentum. Once those elements weakened, cracks spread quickly, trade slowed, security frayed, political fragmentation accelerated. What had seemed like a permanent reshaping of the world revealed itself as a delicate balance. The peace endured for a century, an extraordinary achievement by medieval standards. But it was never immune to time, ambition, or entropy. And as those forces gathered, the Mongol peace quietly began to unravel. As the Pax Mongolica weakened, the world it had connected did not simply snap back into isolation. The structures, habits, and expectations created during a century of relative peace lingered long after Mongol authority faded. Roads fell into disrepair, relay stations emptied, and imperial protection became unreliable. but the idea of a connected world had already taken root. Former Mongol territories evolved along different paths. In China, the Yuan dynasty collapsed, replaced by a native ruling house determined to restore traditional governance and limit foreign influence. In Central Asia and the Middle East, successor states inherited fragments of Mongol administration, blending them with local customs. In Eastern Europe and Russia, Mongol dominance receded slowly, but the political systems shaped under their rule left lasting marks on taxation, military organization, and state authority. Trade did not vanish, but it changed. Long-distance commerce became riskier and more fragmented as borders hardened and conflicts returned. Merchants adjusted by relying more on maritime routes, especially through the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean. In this sense, the decline of the Pax Mongolica indirectly encouraged the rise of sea-based trade networks that would later define the early modern world. Knowledge exchange also slowed, but it did not stop. Texts translated during the Mongol era continued to circulate. Technologies introduced across Eurasia were adapted and refined locally. Gunpowder weapons, printing, and navigational tools evolved independently, shaping future conflicts and exploration. The intellectual momentum generated during the Mongol peace proved difficult to extinguish. Politically, the memory of imperial unity became both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. Rulers recognized the advantages of centralized authority, standardized law, and protected trade. Later empires, from the Ottomans to the Ming, borrowed selectively from Mongol practices, often without acknowledging the source. The idea that stability could be imposed across diverse populations was no longer theoretical, it had been demonstrated. The human cost, however, remained visible. Regions depopulated by war and plague took generations to recover. Entire communities had been relocated or erased. The benefits of connectivity had come with irreversible losses. History did not forget that balance. The end of the Pax Mongolica marked a transition rather than a collapse. The world moved forward carrying both the advantages and the scars of that century. The Mongol peace had shown what was possible when distance lost its power, and what could happen when a single system held too much of the world together. The Pax Mongolica occupies an unusual place in history. It was not born from ideals of harmony or mutual understanding, but from conquest, fear, and absolute power. And yet, its consequences reshaped the world more profoundly than many empires built on nobler claims. For roughly a century, Eurasia functioned as a connected system, politically fractured at the edges but unified in practice by movement, exchange, and enforced stability. What made this peace remarkable was not its morality, but its scale. Never before had so much territory operated under a single framework of security and law. Never before had a merchant, scholar, or traveller been able to cross continents with such relative consistency. The Mongols did not erase cultural differences, they bypassed them. Language, religion, and custom mattered less than obedience to the system. That indifference, harsh as it was, created space for interaction rather than exclusion. The Pax Mongolica also exposed a fundamental truth about globalization long before the word existed. Connection amplifies everything. Wealth spreads faster. Ideas multiply more quickly. So do instability, disease, and inequality. The Mongol world revealed that integration is powerful, but fragile. When the central force weakens, the consequences ripple outward just as efficiently as prosperity once did. Later generations would struggle to interpret this legacy. Some remembered only destruction, associating the Mongols with fire and massacre. Others recognized the deeper transformation, a turning point where the world briefly behaved as a single stage. Both views are correct. The peace enabled exchange precisely because it followed unparalleled violence. The roads were safe because resistance had been crushed. Yet history does not measure outcomes by intention alone. The Mongols did not plan to accelerate technological diffusion, reshape global trade, or prepare the ground for future empires and explorations. They did so anyway. Europe's gradual awakening to the wider world, Asia's expanding networks, and the eventual rise of global commerce all carried traces of this century of motion. When the Pax Mongolica ended, the conditions that sustained it vanished. But the memory of what had been possible did not. The idea that continents could be linked, that knowledge could move freely, and that distance could be conquered had entered human imagination for good. In that sense, the Mongol peace never truly disappeared. It survived as an echo, quiet, unsettling, and transformative, reminding the world that even the harshest empires can leave behind unexpected pathways forward. Long before permanent theatres, written scripts, or named playwrights, performance was woven into the fabric of survival itself. In early civilizations, to perform was not to entertain, but to participate in the unseen forces believed to govern the world. Movement, rhythm, voice, and costume were tools used to communicate with gods, ancestors, and natural powers. A performance was not something you watched. It was something you joined. In prehistoric and early historic societies, communal rituals often followed the cycles of nature: harvests, floods, eclipses, births, and deaths. These moments demanded explanation and control, and performance filled that role. Chants synchronized breathing and belief. Dances mimicked animals, storms, or celestial movements. Masks erased individual identity, allowing performers to become spirits, deities, or mythical ancestors. The goal was transformation, not applause. There was no clear division between performer and audience. Everyone present shared responsibility for the ritual's success. If rain failed to come or illness spread, the failure was collective. Performance functioned as a social glue, reinforcing shared values, shared fears, and shared hopes. To refuse participation was not boredom, it was defiance. Early performances were also political, even before formal states existed. Leaders often presided over rituals, positioning themselves as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. Authority was reinforced through spectacle. When a chief led a ceremony or wore sacred regalia, power became visible, embodied, and unquestionable. Performance taught people where they belonged in the social order. Memory played a crucial role. Without widespread writing, stories were preserved through repetition and dramatization. Myths were not recited flatly, they were reenacted. Heroes were embodied, battles were danced, moral lessons were sung into the body, not written onto a page. Performance was education, history, and theology rolled into one. Crucially, these early forms of performance were communal experiences of emotion. Fear, grief, joy, and hope were expressed publicly and ritually, rather than privately and silently. The community learned how to feel together. In a world without theatres, performance did not need architecture. It needed belief, bodies, and rhythm. Only later would performance separate from ritual and become something to observe rather than inhabit. But its origins remained sacred, collective, and deeply human, born not from leisure, but from the need to understand and survive the world. In ancient Greece, performance began to step out of the purely ritual realm and into something recognizably theatrical. This shift did not abandon the sacred, it reorganized it. Drama emerged from religious festivals dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine, transformation, and ecstasy. What had once been communal chants and processions slowly crystallized into structured performances, complete with actors, choruses, and audiences seated in vast open-air theatres. Greek tragedy was never casual entertainment. Attendance was a civic duty, funded by the state and expected of citizens. Entire cities gathered to watch stories drawn from myth, not to escape reality, but to confront it. These plays explored guilt, fate, justice, and the terrifying limits of human agency. Kings fell, families destroyed themselves, gods watched in silence. And through it all, the audience was asked not to judge from a distance, but to recognize themselves in the suffering on stage. The structure of Greek tragedy reflected its communal origins. The the chorus remained central, representing the collective voice of society. It commented, warned, mourned, and questioned, acting as a moral compass that bridged the gap between actors and audience. Individual characters might defy fate, but the chorus reminded everyone of consequence. This was theatre as social reflection, not spectacle alone. Masks played a crucial role. With exaggerated expressions and standardized forms, they allowed a single actor to embody multiple roles while also stripping characters of individuality. What mattered was not the personal psychology of the performer, but the universal nature of the story. These were not personal tragedies. They were human ones. Theatre architecture reinforced this shared experience. Built into hillsides, Greek theatres were designed so that thousands could see and hear simultaneously. Acoustics were precise. Visibility was democratic. No elite boxes, no hidden corners. Performance unfolded under the open sky, with nature itself as part of the stage. Perhaps most importantly, Greek drama introduced the idea that performance could question power. Kings and heroes were shown to be flawed, arrogant, and blind. Divine justice was ambiguous. Moral certainty was rare. In watching these stories, citizens were invited to wrestle with responsibility and restraint. Greek tragedy transformed performance into a public act of collective thinking. It was sacred, political, and emotional all at once. A rehearsal for citizenship, staged in stone and sunlight. If Greek tragedy confronted audiences with suffering and fate, comedy attacked from a different angle. Laughter in the ancient world was not harmless. It was sharp, public, and deeply political. Greek comedy, especially in its earliest forms, gave voice to frustration, mockery, and social tension in ways tragedy could not. Where tragedy asked audiences to endure, comedy invited them to laugh at authority itself. Like tragedy, comedy grew out of religious festivals honoring Dionysus, but its tone was deliberately unruly. Playwrights filled the stage with exaggerated bodies, obscene jokes, and direct insults aimed at politicians, generals, philosophers, and even the gods. These plays were not subtle. They were loud, vulgar, and fearless. In a society that prized public honor, ridicule was a powerful weapon. The audience was not passive. Comic playwrights spoke directly to spectators, sometimes abandoning the narrative entirely to comment on current events. This breaking of the fourth wall created a sense of intimacy and complicity. The crowd was not just watching satire, it was participating in it. Laughter became a form of communal judgment, signaling approval or condemnation in real time. Masks and costumes amplified the effect. Oversized features, padded bodies, and grotesque caricatures turned recognizable public figures into absurd distortions. By exaggerating flaws, comedy stripped authority of its mystique. A general could be reduced to a coward, a philosopher to a fool. For a few hours, hierarchy collapsed under the weight of humor. This freedom, however, was carefully bounded by time and place. Comedy thrived during festivals, when normal rules were relaxed. Outside those moments, the same words could be dangerous. Performance created a temporary space where criticism was tolerated, even encouraged, before order reasserted itself. Laughter was permitted, but only within the ritual frame. Comedy also served a social function beyond politics. It addressed everyday concerns: marriage, money, food, sex, and aging. By dramatizing shared anxieties, it normalized them. The audience laughed not just at others, but at themselves. In doing so, tension was released and social bonds strengthened. In ancient theatre, comedy proved that performance could be a safety valve. It allowed societies to acknowledge hypocrisy, failure, and desire without tearing themselves apart. Laughter became a form of survival, dangerous, controlled, and profoundly human. When the Romans inherited Greek theatrical traditions, they reshaped them to fit a very different worldview. Roman performance was less concerned with philosophical reflection and more focused on impact. Where Greek theatre invited contemplation, Roman theatre aimed for immediacy. The result was a culture of spectacle, loud, physical, and designed to command attention rather than provoke quiet thought. Roman drama expanded beyond tragedy and comedy into forms that emphasized movement and visual excess. Pantomime became especially popular. These performances featured masked dancers who told entire stories through gesture alone, accompanied by music and chorus. The lead performer played multiple roles, shifting identity through posture and motion. The audience did not need complex dialogue. Meaning was carried by the body. Theatres themselves grew larger and more monumental. Unlike Greek theatres embedded into natural hillsides, Roman theatres were freestanding architectural statements. Stone, arches, and towering stage facades reminded audiences of imperial power before the performance even began. The building was part of the message. Rome was permanent, engineered, and dominant. Performance in Rome was inseparable from politics. Public games and theatrical shows were sponsored by elites seeking popularity and favour. Entertainment became a currency of power. To provide spectacles was to demonstrate generosity, wealth, and control. Crowds were fed, amused, and distracted, reinforcing loyalty to the state and its leaders. Actors, however, occupied a strange social position. While adored by audiences, they were often viewed with suspicion or contempt by elites. Performance was seen as morally ambiguous, associated with deception and emotional excess. Actors could portray gods and heroes on stage, yet be denied full social respect of it. This tension reflected Roman anxieties about appearance versus reality. Censorship also played a role. Unlike the open mockery of Greek comedy, Roman satire was more carefully constrained. Direct attacks on powerful figures were dangerous. Performance still commented on society, but often through allegory, myth, or exaggerated types rather than named individuals. The state tolerated critique only so far. Roman theatre transformed performance into a tool of empire. It entertained, unified, and distracted vast populations. Emotion was stirred, but rarely allowed to destabilize authority. In Rome, performance was no longer just sacred or communal, it was managed. And in that management, theatre revealed how power could choreograph emotion on a massive scale. In ancient Egypt, performance never fully separated from religion. There was no clear boundary between theatre, ritual, and ceremony. To perform was to reenact cosmic order, to participate in the eternal struggle between balance and chaos. Performance did not exist for novelty or critique, but for continuity. Each reenactment reaffirmed that the universe was still functioning as it should. Temple rituals formed the heart of Egyptian performance culture. Priests acted out sacred narratives through movement, costume, chant, and procession. These were not symbolic gestures. They were believed to have real effects. When a priest performed a ritual, the gods were not merely honoured, they were activated. The performance maintained Mat, the divine principle of harmony and balance that held the world together. One of the most important ritual performances was the reenactment of the myth of Osiris. Through ceremonial drama, the murder, dismemberment, and resurrection of the god were staged repeatedly across centuries. This was not entertainment for an audience seeking novelty. It was repetition with purpose. Each reenactment promised renewal, fertility, and the continuity of kingship. The story did not change, because the cosmos could not afford it to change. The pharaoh stood at the center of this performative universe. Every public appearance was carefully staged. Clothing, posture, and gesture communicated divine authority. The king was not pretending to be a god. He was performing godhood as a function of rule. Ceremony legitimized power. Without ritual, authority dissolved. Unlike Greek or Roman theatre, Egyptian performance was often restricted. Many rituals were hidden from public view, conducted deep within temple complexes. Mystery itself was part of the performance. What was unseen carried weight. Silence, darkness, and repetition created an atmosphere where belief thrived without explanation. Music and movement played essential roles. Sistrums, drums, and chanting regulated tempo and emotion. Dance was controlled and symbolic, not expressive in a personal sense. The individual performer mattered less than the precision of the act. Mistakes were dangerous. Improvisation was unthinkable. In Egypt, performance was timeless. Actors did not seek applause or fame. They sought correctness. By reenacting sacred stories exactly as prescribed, performers linked the present to the distant past. Theatre here was not about change or debate. It was about ensuring that tomorrow looked like yesterday. In ancient India, performance developed along a path that blended ritual, philosophy, and aesthetic theory into a uniquely refined dramatic tradition. Sanskrit drama was not designed to shock, mock, or overwhelm its audience. Instead, it sought harmony between actor and spectator, story and emotion, earthly life and cosmic order. Theatre here was a disciplined art of feeling. Central to Indian performance was the concept of rasa, often translated as essence or flavour. A play was successful not because of plot twists or realism, but because it evoked specific emotional states in the audience. Love, sorrow, heroism, fear, wonder, and serenity were carefully cultivated through dialogue, gesture, music, and rhythm. The audience was meant to taste emotion, not be consumed by it. Actors underwent rigorous training. Every movement of the hand, eye, and foot carried meaning. Facial expressions were codified. Posture signaled status, mood, and intention. Improvisation was limited. Precision mattered. Performance was closer to ritual than realism. The actor did not disappear into the character, but presented emotion as something shared and recognizable. Sanskrit drama also avoided certain extremes. Tragedy, in the Greek sense, was largely absent. Death and despair occurred off-stage, softened by poetic language and moral resolution. The goal was balance, not rupture. Even when suffering appeared, it pointed toward restoration and order. Theatre reflected an idealized vision of the world, not as it was, but as it should be. Religious ideas shaped this approach. Hindu and Buddhist philosophies emphasized cycles, detachment, and the illusion of permanence. Performance echoed these beliefs. Characters were archetypal rather than psychologically fragmented. Kings embodied justice. Lovers embodied devotion. Villains embodied disorder. Through these figures, audiences contemplated ethical and cosmic truths. Performance spaces were intimate. Unlike massive Roman theatres, Sanskrit drama favoured courtly settings and smaller gatherings. The experience was communal but focused, encouraging attentive listening rather than spectacle. Music and song were integral, guiding emotional transitions and reinforcing memory. In ancient India, theatre was a bridge between inner experience and outer expression. It taught audiences how to feel without losing control, how to witness emotion without drowning in it. Performance was not an escape from reality. It was training for understanding it. Across the ancient world, performance relied on the body long before it relied on words. Masks, gesture, posture, and movement formed a shared language that could cross borders of speech and literacy. In societies where many could not read, and where audiences were often multilingual, the body became the most reliable storyteller. Performance was seen as something you understood with your eyes as much as your ears. Masks were central to this physical vocabulary. In Greece, Rome, ritual Africa, and parts of Asia, masks transformed performers into something other than human. They exaggerated emotion, erased individuality, and allowed a single actor to embody gods, spirits, or multiple characters. The mask did not hide the performer, it elevated them. Once worn, personal identity dissolved, and symbolic identity took over. Movement followed strict conventions. A raised arm, a turned head, a measured step could communicate status, intention, or fate. In many traditions, walking itself was codified. Kings moved differently from servants. Gods moved differently from mortals. These rules allowed audiences to immediately recognize relationships and power dynamics without explanation. Performance was legible at a glance. This emphasis on the body also shaped training. Actors were not casual entertainers. They were specialists who spent years mastering control over breath, balance, and expression. Voice projection mattered, but so did stillness. Silence could carry meaning just as powerfully as speech. In ritual contexts especially, restraint signaled authority. Dance occupied a space between theatre and ceremony. In Egypt, India, and parts of the Mediterranean, dance told stories that words could not. Myth, cosmology, and moral lessons unfolded through rhythm and repetition. The dancer did not express personal emotion. They embodied shared meaning. Precision mattered more than originality. The audience, in turn, learned to read these signals. Watching a performance required cultural literacy. Spectators understood when a gesture signaled mourning, when a pause meant divine intervention, when a turn of the body marked betrayal. Performance reinforced shared codes of meaning, reminding communities that they spoke the same symbolic language. In ancient theatre, the body was sacred territory. It was disciplined, trained, and transformed into a vessel of meaning. Words could be forgotten or misunderstood. Movement endured. Long before scripts survived on paper, performance lived in muscle memory and ritual repetition, passed from body to body across generations. Across ancient civilizations, theatre and performance served a purpose far deeper than storytelling. They functioned as social glue, binding individuals into a shared emotional and moral universe. When people gathered to watch a performance, they were not merely consuming a story. They were participating in a collective act of recognition, affirming who they were as a community and what they believed mattered. Public performance created shared memory. A play seen together became a reference point long after the actors left the stage. Lines were remembered, gestures imitated, scenes debated. In societies with limited written records, these shared experiences helped preserve values and history. Performance became a living archive, refreshed each time it was reenacted. Theatre also acted as a mirror. It reflected social roles, tensions, and contradictions back to the audience in a form that could be examined safely. Kings watched themselves portrayed as just or tyrannical. Citizens saw their fears dramatized. Families recognized their conflicts in mythic form. This reflection was not always comfortable, but it was controlled. The stage allowed societies to confront themselves without immediate consequence. Importantly, performance equalized experience. In a theatre, social hierarchies blurred. Elites and commoners sat within sight of one another, reacting to the same moments. Laughter, silence, and grief spread through the crowd collectively. For a few hours, emotional experience overrode status. This did not erase inequality, but it temporarily suspended it. Performance also taught emotional regulation. Ancient societies understood that unchecked emotion could be dangerous. Theatre provided a sanctioned outlet for grief, anger, desire, and fear. Tragedy allowed sorrow to be felt deeply, but resolved symbolically. Comedy released tension through laughter. Ritual performance transformed anxiety into order. Audiences practiced feeling together without losing control. The communal aspect extended beyond the event itself. Festivals structured calendars. Performances marked seasons, victories, and transitions. Participation signaled belonging. To attend was to affirm membership in the community. To understand the performance was to understand the culture. In this way, ancient theatre was not passive reflection. It was active maintenance. It reinforced norms, tested boundaries, and reminded people that they were part of something larger than themselves. Performance did not merely depict society. It helped hold it together. By the end of antiquity, performance had become more than a moment shared in time. It had become memory, preserved not only in texts and ruins, but in habits, structures, and expectations that survived long after stages fell silent. Ancient theatre shaped how later cultures understood storytelling, emotion, and the act of gathering itself. Even when traditions faded, their influence lingered. As empires declined and religious priorities shifted, many forms of ancient performance disappeared or transformed. Greek theatres crumbled. Roman spectacles lost their audiences. Temple rituals were reinterpreted or suppressed. Yet the idea that stories could be embodied, staged, and shared publicly did not vanish. It adapted. Medieval religious drama, court performances, and later theatrical traditions all carried traces of ancient practice, even when their creators no longer remembered the source. What endured most strongly was the communal expectation. Performance remained something meant to be witnessed together. The separation between performer and audience became more defined, but the emotional contract remained. Spectators still gathered, still reacted collectively, still recognized themselves in stories told by others. The ancient understanding that performance was a shared experience, not a private one, proved resilient. The sacred dimension also survived, though often in altered form. Ritual drama gave way to morality plays, mystery cycles, and symbolic reenactments of religious narratives. Emotion continued to be structured and guided through performance, echoing older traditions where theatre trained people how to feel, grieve, celebrate, and endure. Ancient performance also left behind a vocabulary of space. Theatres, stages, and viewing areas continued to shape architecture. Even modern performance spaces inherit assumptions about sightlines, acoustics, and audience focus that were first tested in stone amphitheatres and temple courtyards. Perhaps most importantly, ancient theatre established performance as a way of preserving identity. Stories repeated across generations became anchors in times of change. Through reenactment, communities remembered who they had been and who they aspired to be. Performance allowed the past to remain present, not as static memory, but as lived experience. In the ancient world, theatre was sacred, political, and communal all at once. Its legacy is not confined to history. Every time people gather to watch a story unfold together, they echo a practice that once shaped entire civilizations. Socrates did not look like a philosopher, and that was part of the problem. In a city that prized appearance, status, and public performance, he stood out by refusing all three. He walked barefoot through the streets of Athens, dressed in the same worn cloak day after day, indifferent to comfort and openly dismissive of wealth. His face was famously unattractive, his posture awkward, his manner blunt. Nothing about him suggested wisdom in the way Athenians expected it to appear. Yet this unimpressive figure had a habit that unsettled everyone he encountered. He asked questions, not polite ones, not theoretical ones. Simple, direct questions aimed at things people assumed they understood. What is justice? What is virtue? What is wisdom? And once someone answered, Socrates would continue asking, gently but relentlessly, until the answer collapsed under its own contradictions. Socrates claimed to know nothing. This was not false modesty. He treated ignorance as a starting point, not a weakness. In a society obsessed with reputation, he made ignorance visible. He exposed how often confidence substituted for understanding, how easily admired men relied on memorized phrases instead of thought. His conversations often ended with his interlocutors confused, embarrassed, or quietly furious. He did not teach in schools or lecture halls. He taught in marketplaces, gymnasiums, workshops, and street corners. He spoke to generals and politicians with the same tone he used for craftsmen and slaves. Rank did not impress him. Authority meant nothing if it could not withstand scrutiny. This equal treatment was deeply offensive in a hierarchical society. Socrates also refused payment. Sophists charged high fees to train young men in rhetoric and persuasion. Socrates offered no curriculum and took no money. This made him difficult to categorize and impossible to control. He undermined professional teachers simply by existing alongside them, asking better questions for free. To some, he was amusing, a harmless eccentric. To others, he was dangerous. He disrupted conversations, embarrassed leaders, and taught young Athenians that revered opinions could be dismantled with patience and logic. He did not propose reforms or lead factions. He destabilized certainty itself. Athens tolerated many things: ambition disguised as virtue, even corruption. But Socrates offered no performance of respectability. He refused to play the role society expected of a wise man. And in doing so, he quietly became one of the most unsettling figures the city had ever produced. Athens in the 5th century before the Common Era was a city built on display. Political life unfolded in public assemblies. Legal battles were theatrical performances before massive juries. Success depended less on truth than on persuasion, confidence, and the ability to appear convincing. Reputation was currency. To be seen as wise, honourable, and capable mattered as much as actually being those things. This culture produced professionals of persuasion. Sophists travelled from city to city, offering instruction in rhetoric, logic, and debate. For a fee, they taught young men how to win arguments in court, sway assemblies, and defend any position with equal confidence. Skill mattered more than substance. Victory, not truth, was the goal. Athens admired this talent openly. A man who could speak well could rise quickly. Socrates existed as a living contradiction to this system. He refused to perform wisdom. He claimed ignorance where others claimed mastery. He did not prepare speeches or train students to persuade crowds. Instead, he dismantled arguments one conversation at a time, often in front of onlookers. Where sophists built reputations, Socrates quietly unbuilt them. The humiliation was subtle but devastating. A respected politician, praised for intelligence, might find himself unable to define justice under gentle questioning. A celebrated general could not explain courage without contradicting himself. These exchanges did not end with applause. They ended in silence, confusion, and wounded pride. Socrates rarely mocked his interlocutors directly. He let their own words do the damage. Athenians laughed at first. The city enjoyed clever irony and intellectual sport, but laughter turned to irritation as the pattern repeated. Socrates seemed to target those most admired. The higher a man's reputation, the more satisfying it was to watch it unravel. Over time, resentment grew, not because Socrates insulted people, but because he exposed them. The problem was not simply embarrassment, it was influence. Young Athenians watched these encounters and learned a dangerous lesson: that public honour could be hollow, and that authority could be questioned without violence. Socrates did not tell them to rebel. He showed them how easily certainty could be dismantled. In a democracy already anxious about instability, this was unsettling. Athens had lost wars, endured plagues, and suffered internal betrayals. The city clung tightly to the idea that respected men knew what they were doing. Socrates challenged that illusion relentlessly. In a culture built on reputation, Socrates did not merely ask questions. He undermined the foundation on which public life stood. What truly set Socrates apart was not his appearance or his poverty, but the way he thought. Or more precisely, the way he forced others to think. His approach to conversation, later called the Socratic method, was disarmingly simple. He began by asking someone to define a concept they claimed to understand. Justice, courage, piety, wisdom. The questions sounded innocent. The consequences were not. Socrates never argued aggressively. He did not raise his voice or deliver long speeches. Instead, he asked short, precise questions and followed the answers wherever they led. Each response generated another question. Each clarification exposed a new contradiction. Slowly, the confident speaker found himself tangled in his own words. What began as certainty dissolved into confusion. This method was not designed to humiliate, though humiliation often followed. Socrates insisted that discovering ignorance was progress. To recognize that you do not know is the first step toward genuine understanding. He believed most people lived with false confidence, mistaking inherited opinions for knowledge. His method stripped those opinions down to their foundations and found them wanting. For the person being questioned, the experience could be deeply uncomfortable. Reputation collapsed in public. Answers that once impressed audiences now sounded empty. Socrates offered no replacement doctrine, no final definition to cling to. He ended conversations in uncertainty not resolution. Many found this infuriating. A man who takes away your certainty without offering comfort is rarely loved. To Socrates, however, this discomfort was ethical. He believed unexamined beliefs led to injustice, arrogance, and moral failure. A society that rewarded confidence over understanding was dangerous. His questioning was a form of moral surgery, painful, but necessary. If it hurt, that meant it was working. The method also revealed a deeper threat. It treated all participants as intellectually equal. Kings, generals, artisans, everyone was subject to the same logical standards. No title could protect a bad argument. In a society built on hierarchy and honor, this leveling effect was radical. Socrates' conversations spread by word of mouth. They were witnessed, remembered, repeated. Even those who avoided him heard stories of men undone by simple questions. His reputation grew, paradoxically, as a man who denied having wisdom. He became famous for exposing the illusion of wisdom in others. The Socratic method did not create enemies through insult or rebellion. It created them through silence, confusion, and self-doubt. And over time, that proved far more dangerous than open defiance. Socrates insisted he was not a teacher, yet few figures in Athens shaped young minds more profoundly. He founded no school, wrote no curriculum, and accepted no formal students. Instead, learning gathered around him organically, drawn by curiosity rather than obligation. Young Athenians followed him through the city, listening as he questioned merchants, politicians, and generals with equal calm. Education, in Socrates' world, happened in motion. This refusal to formalize teaching was deliberate. Schools implied authority and doctrine. Socrates rejected both. He believed wisdom could not be handed down like a set of rules. It had to be discovered through questioning. Anyone claiming to teach virtue, in his view, misunderstood it. Virtue was not information. It was a way of examining one's life. Among those drawn to him were men who would later define Athenian intellectual history. Plato was the most famous. As a young man, Plato was captivated by Socrates' relentless honesty and moral seriousness. He would later preserve Socrates' conversations in dialogue form, transforming a man who wrote nothing into one of the most influential voices in Western thought. Without Plato, Socrates might have vanished into rumour. Not all followers reflected well on their informal mentor. Alcibiades, brilliant, ambitious, and notoriously unstable, admired Socrates deeply while embodying everything Socrates criticized. Charismatic and reckless, Alcibiades would later betray Athens politically, lending weight to the accusation that Socrates corrupted the youth. Whether Socrates influenced Alcibiades, or merely failed to restrain him, became a question with deadly consequences. This was the danger of Socrates' influence. He encouraged independent thought, but offered no safeguards against misuse. He dismantled certainty without rebuilding structure. For some students, this led to intellectual humility. For others, it fed arrogance, the belief that all conventions were empty and all authority suspect. Socrates took no responsibility for how his ideas were applied. He believed moral responsibility belonged to the individual. This stance made sense philosophically, but it looked irresponsible politically. Athens expected teachers to shape loyal citizens. Socrates shaped questioners instead. To the city, this distinction mattered. A man who attracted youth, challenged norms, and refused accountability appeared increasingly suspect. What had once seemed like harmless eccentricity began to look like influence without control. Socrates had no school, but his presence educated a generation. And Athens would soon decide that this kind of education was a threat it could no longer tolerate. Socrates did not live in a stable or confident city. His adult life unfolded during Athens' long descent from imperial power to humiliation. The Peloponnesian War drained resources, killed thousands, and shattered the belief that Athenian democracy was invincible. Plague swept through the city. Allies defected. Enemies pressed in. By the end, Athens was defeated, occupied, and deeply traumatized. In times like these, societies look for reassurance. They reward loyalty, conformity, and comforting narratives. Socrates offered none of that. He did not praise the crowd. He did not flatter leaders. He did not blame enemies for everything that went wrong. Instead, he continued asking whether Athens was just, whether its decisions were wise, and whether its leaders actually understood virtue at all. This made him intolerable to many. Questioning authority during peace is annoying. Questioning it after defeat feels like betrayal. Socrates had served as a soldier earlier in life and was widely regarded as personally brave. He endured hardship without complaint and showed physical courage in battle. This made it harder to dismiss him as a coward or foreign sympathizer. His loyalty was not in doubt. His judgment was. During moments of political crisis, Socrates refused to cooperate with injustice, even when ordered by the state. When democratic leaders demanded unlawful actions, he declined. When an oligarchic regime briefly seized power and ordered him to participate in arrests, he again refused. He did not protest loudly. He simply did not comply. This quiet resistance infuriated both sides. Democracies tolerate dissent poorly when frightened. Tyrannies tolerate it not at all. Socrates managed to alienate every faction without joining any of them. He obeyed the law when it was just and ignored it when it was not, according to his own moral compass. To Socrates, conscience mattered more than survival. To Athens, this looked like arrogance. A citizen who decides for himself which laws to follow undermines the entire system. In a city struggling to reassert control after chaos, this kind of moral independence felt dangerous. By the time peace returned, Athens was eager to restore order and identity. Old wounds were still open. Memories of betrayal lingered. And Socrates, still walking barefoot and asking uncomfortable questions, became an easy symbol of disorder, a reminder of doubt in a city desperate for certainty. The war had ended. The patience for Socrates had not survived it. The case against Socrates did not begin with a single outrage. It accumulated slowly, built from years of irritation, embarrassment, and fear. By the time formal charges were brought, the city had already decided that something had to be done. The trial would not determine whether Socrates was dangerous. It would determine whether Athens could tolerate him any longer. The accusations were deceptively simple. Socrates was charged with impiety, failing to acknowledge the gods of the city and introducing new divine influences, and with corrupting the youth. On paper, these were religious and moral offences. In reality, they were political and social. Athens was not prosecuting theology, it was prosecuting disruption. Impiety was a flexible charge, useful precisely because it was vague. Socrates spoke often of a divine inner voice, a guiding sign that warned him away from certain actions. He did not claim it was a god, but he did treat it as authoritative. To traditionalists, this sounded suspicious. In a city trying to restore religious and civic unity after catastrophe, deviation was dangerous. The charge of corrupting the youth carried more weight. Socrates had influenced young men who questioned authority, mocked public figures, and treated tradition with skepticism. Some of those men had later betrayed Athens or supported oligarchic rule. Whether Socrates caused this behavior was irrelevant. In a traumatized city, association was enough. Importantly, Socrates had powerful enemies. Men he had embarrassed publicly, politicians whose authority he had undermined, teachers whose profession he had quietly exposed as hollow. The trial gave these resentments a legal outlet. The charges were brought by ordinary citizens, but they spoke for a broader unease. Athens had amnesties for wartime crimes and political betrayals. It claimed to be healing. Yet here was a man who refused to stop reopening wounds. He reminded people how easily they had been misled, how confident men had failed catastrophically. For a city desperate to move forward, Socrates felt like an anchor dragging it backward into doubt. The irony was cruel. Socrates believed he was serving Athens by challenging it. He saw questioning as an act of loyalty, not rebellion. But the city no longer wanted to be questioned. It wanted reassurance, stability, and clear boundaries. The trial was not about whether Socrates believed in the gods. It was about whether a society under strain could survive a man who refused to stop asking why. When the trial began, many Athenians expected Socrates to save himself. The courts were not neutral arenas of law in the modern sense. Verdicts were shaped by emotion, reputation, and performance. Defendants were expected to plead, flatter, and appeal to pity. Tears were common. Family members were paraded before juries. A good performance could mean the difference between life and death. Socrates refused all of it. He did not deny that he questioned people. He did not apologize for unsettling them. He did not promise to change. Instead of begging the jury for mercy, he challenged them to examine themselves. He argued that he had done Athens a service by exposing false confidence and moral laziness. Far from corrupting the youth, he claimed to have encouraged them to care about virtue rather than wealth or status. This was not how trials were won. His tone was calm, almost conversational, but the content was confrontational. He compared himself to a gadfly, small, irritating and necessary, sent to sting a sluggish horse into movement. Athens, he suggested, was that horse. Killing the gadfly would not make the city wiser, only more comfortable. When it came time to propose a punishment, Socrates again defied expectation. Instead of suggesting exile or a fine as a compromise, he half-jokingly proposed that he be rewarded with free meals for life, an honour given to civic benefactors. The suggestion was not sarcasm in the modern sense. He genuinely believed it. He had improved the city, not harmed it. The jury did not find this amusing. To many, his behaviour confirmed the worst suspicions. He appeared arrogant, unrepentant, and dismissive of the court's authority. Even jurors inclined to acquit him were pushed toward conviction by his refusal to play along. In a system that relied on performance, Socrates rejected performance entirely. The verdict was close, but guilty. After the conviction, Socrates was given a final chance to propose an alternative penalty. Only then did he reluctantly agree to a fine, urged by friends who feared the worst. It was too late. The damage had been done. The jury chose death. Socrates did not panic. He did not rage. He accepted the outcome with the same calm he brought to every conversation. The city had judged him. Now it would have to live with the judgment. The trial revealed a final bitter truth. Athens could forgive failure, corruption, even betrayal. What it could not forgive was a man who refused to pretend. After the trial, Socrates did not die immediately. A religious observance delayed executions, granting him several weeks in prison. Friends visited daily, urging him to escape. Plans were made, bribes arranged, guards could be persuaded. Exile was possible. Everyone around him assumed he would take the opportunity. No one would have blamed him. Socrates refused. To flee, he argued, would betray everything he had spent his life defending. He had questioned unjust laws, yes, but he had also insisted that laws, once accepted, bound the citizen. To escape punishment now would make his principles convenient rather than serious. If he taught that justice mattered only when it was comfortable, then his entire life had been a performance after all. Instead of despair, Socrates spent his final days talking. He debated the nature of the soul, the meaning of death, and whether a good man could truly be harmed by injustice. His tone was calm, even playful. Death, he suggested, was either a dreamless sleep or a journey to converse with wiser minds. Either way, it held no terror for someone who had lived honestly. When the time came, the executioner brought the cup of hemlock. The poison was meant to be drunk slowly, its effects creeping upward from the feet to the heart. Socrates did not hesitate. He took the cup without complaint and drank it steadily, as if finishing an ordinary conversation. As his body began to fail, he continued speaking. He reminded his companions to care for their souls more than their reputations. He corrected small philosophical errors. Even dying, he could not resist refining ideas. When the poison reached his chest and his breathing slowed, he lay down calmly. His last words were practical, almost mundane. He reminded a friend to pay a small debt, a sacrificial offering owed to a god. It was a final act of civic responsibility, a quiet assertion that he had never rejected the city itself, only its complacency. With that, Socrates died. There was no dramatic outburst, no final curse, no miracle. Just a man who faced death the same way he faced life, with questions, clarity, and refusal to pretend. The city had silenced him. It had not answered him. Athens succeeded in ending Socrates' life. It failed completely at ending his influence. In the years after his death, the city moved on, but the questions he raised did not fade. Instead, they multiplied. The man who wrote nothing became one of the most discussed figures in history, preserved through the memories and writings of those who had listened to him. Most influential among them was Plato, who transformed Socrates into the central figure of his philosophical dialogues. Through these works, Socrates continued to walk the streets of Athens, questioning politicians, poets, and generals long after the real man was gone. Whether Plato's Socrates perfectly matched the historical one mattered less than the role he came to play, the voice of relentless inquiry. Socrates became a symbol of moral courage. He did not die for a doctrine, a movement, or a revolution. He died for a method, for the idea that questioning mattered more than comfort and integrity more than survival. Unlike martyrs who demand belief, Socrates demanded examination. His legacy was not obedience, but doubt. This made him endlessly adaptable. Different ages claimed him for different causes. Some saw him as a champion of reason against superstition, others as a religious man obeying divine conscience over human law. To some, he was a model citizen who accepted punishment rather than flee. To others, a warning about what happens when societies silence dissent. What remained constant was the discomfort he caused. Socrates refused to give final answers. He never explained how to build the perfect state or guarantee virtue. He exposed ignorance without offering closure. Even in death, he resisted being turned into a slogan. Athens eventually recognized its mistake. Later generations honored Socrates as one of the city's greatest figures, even as they quietly forgot the conditions that led to his execution. It is easier to admire a dead philosopher than to tolerate a living one. Socrates' true legacy lies not in what he taught, but in how he lived. He treated thought as a moral duty. He believed that clarity mattered more than approval, and truth more than safety. In a world still obsessed with reputation and certainty, his life remains an accusation. The barefoot philosopher asked too many questions, and centuries later, we are still trying to answer them.